Hey everybody, my name is Melisha McGregor, and we're back again with another DevOps Fundamentals. So this time we'll be talking about containers and how they're important in DevOps. So a container is just a single unit that contains everything for your application. That means it has all of the dependencies you need, and it's not going to rely on the operating system that you're running on. That's probably one of the most important things with containers. The underlying operating system and hardware don't matter at all. Everything that your application needs to run is inside of that Docker container, which gets rid of that whole issue with, oh, it runs on my machine. And the reason it does that is because it keeps the environment consistent for the code. Like I mentioned earlier, you get to carry all of your dependencies with you. You get to specify which ports you want open, and you get to make sure that no matter what operating system you're on, the code works the exact same. There's no more trying to figure out, why does this code work on a Windows machine but it doesn't work on a Mac OS? That is the whole point of containers. So you might be wondering, well, these sound really cool, so they're probably hard to make. It's nothing like making a virtual machine. Docker containers are a lot more simple. So if you want more details on how to build Docker containers and how to get your application up and running in Docker, I highly recommend you check out the documentation on docker.com. They've done a great job with examples, and there's a huge community behind Docker. So one really interesting thing is that containers aren't a new concept. Linux has been using containers for years, and Docker was just the one that was able to make sure these containers ran across all of the systems. So, little history for you, and hopefully that helps make a little more sense of this. But when you're trying to build a Docker container, you need a Docker image first. And this is basically an entire container that will run this specific JavaScript application. So you see that we have our node dependency. So we are able to specify which version of node this application needs to run. You don't have to worry about that anymore. Like, there's no more needing to do the node-v in your terminal to make sure that you have the correct version. It comes built into the container because you've set the command in the image for it. And if you look at the commands for a Docker image, it might remind you of a bash script or something like that. It's not quite the same, but it's really, really similar. So you'll import all of the files you need to make your application, and they'll be inside of the container at this root directory. Then you'll go ahead and install all the dependencies for your application. You'll make sure that it's running on a port you can access, because with containers, you have this, it's a container, so it's not connected to the port that's on your computer directly, and that's what that little expose command is for. And then you go ahead and run your commands like normal, but it's all happening inside the container. And if you're curious of what a container looks like when it's running, when you have Docker installed on your local machine, you can go into Docker, and this is what a running container would look like. It's nothing that's just, oh my gosh, it's so wild, and I don't know, it's not as complicated as people try to make it seem. Once you have your image and you build it, you can run your container and your application is good to go. That is why it's so useful in DevOps, because we need that level of consistency to make sure that our application code gets to production with as few problems as possible. And you know how it is when you have to provision servers. Sometimes there's these weird package updates, and then the next thing you know, your app just doesn't run on production anymore. That is the point of using containers in DevOps. And so you might be wondering, if we have this container, how exactly do we get the container to production? Well, you deploy it, just like you would any type of code. That's what you do. You just deploy the container like regular. It's another command that you run, and it just goes. But there are a few things you do need to know before you get to that point. The first thing, do not create golden images. A golden image is one that's deviated from your normal canonical versioning, which means you've pulled down an image and you've made changes that override that exact image file. When you go back to debug things later, this is a really bad thing to have because typically only one or two people know how that golden image works. And if they ever leave, you have to start all over with a new image. So make sure that you aren't making changes directly to images, just like you wouldn't make changes to code that's in production without going through the deploy process first. And it's okay if you spend a little time testing your container. That might mean you pull down the container to your local machine and make sure that the right ports are exposed, make sure that the right version of Node or whatever Ruby installation you need. You're just checking to make sure that the image has everything that you need for your code to run. And then, of course, there's image orchestration. So this is really commonly seen with large applications. Maybe some of them use microservices, and you can use Docker to create a container for each of those parts of the project. And then you can use another tool called Kubernetes to orchestrate those different containers so that they're getting the updates that they need, they're getting any type of environment variables that need to be set. This is just a way that you can kind of centralize all of those different processes that need to be deployed out. So now that you know a little bit about containers being used in DevOps, the main thing that I would like you to take away from this is just that containers make it so easy to share code with other developers. You don't have to worry about those weird issues that come from running git clone, but your system doesn't have the right versions or the right dependencies that the code needs to run successfully. So even if you don't use containers in DevOps, it's a really good practice to use just if you're developing code. So I hope that this was helpful and you were able to get a high level understanding of how containers are used in DevOps.